Thanks so much for coming. I just want to acknowledge, first off, that the title of this talk is "Developers and Depression." You probably had other, seemingly more fun things you could do at 1 o'clock the first day back from a long holiday, and so I just wanted to first just say thank you for showing up, and just wanted to over the course of this talk, I wanted to talk a little bit more about things we can do to destigmatize mental illness in the industry. And just the fact that you're willing to show up and listen to a talk like this today it really means a lot to me. So thank you so much for that. Just a couple things about me. Sam said, I work at Twilio. I lead the developer community team. I was on the evangelism team prior to that. And I'm a developer. And also I have bipolar and ADHD. And what I want to do over the next 30, 40 minutes or so is just tell you a little bit about my story as a developer having mental illness. I want to talk a little bit about how mental illness seems to specifically impact the tech community. And then want to chat a little bit about what we could do about it. So let me tell you just a little bit about my story. So I started programming when I was pretty young. I had a TRS-80. I started learning BASIC on that, and I was probably on this machine. I think I was probably doing Pascal. And for some reason, my parents bought a computer when they were real young. My dad's a pastor, my mom's a nurse, and there wasn't really reason to have a computer in the 80s, but they got one, and I just took to it. And there was no internet, and so programming was about the most fun thing you could do. It gave you lots of instant gratification. And then I ended up graduating high school and then going off to college. And I hated college. I was a really bad student. This is the engineering library at the University of Illinois. And I remember going to this library and looking at all these people sitting down studying, just being how do they do that? How do they just sit there for hours and just read books and study and be so studious? And when I was kind of when I got to school, smart enough that I could get by my first couple years by cramming and trying to learn everything the night before and doing okay on the exam. But that strategy kind of stopped working once I got to 300 level math classes. It turns out you can't learn linear algebra in a night. I tried twice and it didn't work either time. And for me, things really came to a head, and I really started to get very depressed on my 5th year of college. It's the victory lap, as they like to call it. But it wasn't particularly victorious for me. I had just moved to this shitty apartment. Can I say shit at Google? Is that fine? Sorry. All right, cool. No, that's not, all right, great. It was a shitty apartment. And I was living up here on the top floor, the 3rd floor up here. Most of my friends had graduated in 4 years, and I was trying to wrestle with why didn't I? I had just broken up with a girlfriend, my first girlfriend. It's my first time ever living alone, and I was on my way to fail out, and I didn't know how to tell my parents that a pastor and a nurse that they were 80 grand deep, and I wasn't going to get a degree, and I just got really depressed. And when I get depressed, one of the most obvious symptoms for me is that I just end up sleeping a lot. And back then, I was sleeping 12, 16 hours a day. I actually remember I had one day when I woke up and I was at the 20-hour mark, and I was if I just sleep for 4 more hours, then I'll be able to brag that I slept for 24 hours. So here I am. I could have that thing I can pull out now at parties and stuff. And the problem with this was that I was really good at hiding, and most of my friends had graduated. And I stopped going to class, I stopped going to work, and I put on a good front. And I had one friend who noticed, this guy Bill that I worked with. And he noticed that I hadn't been to work in weeks. And he had sent me a couple emails just saying, hey, Greg, what's going on? You okay? And I ignored him because I didn't know how to tell him, how to explain what was going on. I was just so ashamed. And one day, it's a Wednesday at 2 o'clock, and I'm still in bed. And my phone rings. I roll over, I look at the bill, and I ignore it. And then it rings again, and I ignore it again. And then a few minutes later, I hear a knock on my door. And when you're forgetful like I am, there's like these certain like life maintenance tasks that you just kind of accept aren't going to happen. And back then, locking my doors was one of them. Because it was like way more likely I was going to forget my keys than like someone was going to break into my apartment. And so I'm laying there in bed, I hear the knock on my door, and when I hear the doorknob start to turn, I panicked a bit. And at the time I was sleeping on like this, my apartment had hardwood floors, and I was sleeping on this cheap mattress is on like the metal bed frame that had the plastic casters on it. So the bed would roll around a little bit, and the bed had rolled like this far away from the wall. And so I very slowly slid into that gap between the bed and the wall. And I just pulled the covers over my head. And Bill walked into my apartment, and he poked his head into my bedroom, and he poked his head in my office, and then he walked out the front door. That's what shame feels like. I failed out. I moved back home to Indianapolis with my parents. I was so ashamed I didn't know how to tell them, and so I lied to them. I told them that I graduated. And I thought maybe the problem was school. I thought maybe the problem was just the wrong environment for me. I was a pretty good programmer, and I thought maybe if I just did more of that, the life would get better. And so I started doing freelance web development work in PHP. This is around like 2003. And all the same stuff just kept happening. I would put off the project with the client until the night before I said I'd have it done. He'd start calling, I'd dodge the call, he'd call the house, I'd start coming home late and dodging my parents when they'd ask about it. And this just went on for months. And I had this friend, he's in college. He said, Greg's one of the smartest kids I know, but he's also the laziest person I know. And I believed that. So I didn't have any other excuse. I slept all day, I didn't do work, I had these awesome opportunities to be able to go to school and whatnot, and I had squandered them. And this pattern just kept repeating over and over and over again, and I couldn't figure out how to stop it. There's this verse in the Bible that says, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I don't do. But that which I hate, I do. And I hated what I was doing. So one night, in desperation, just feeling at the end of my rope, I went to that place that you go when you have questions about life that seem to have no answers. And I Googled it. I just typed in chronic procrastination, because that was the best way I could think to explain what was happening to me. Best way I could think to explain my behavior. And it wasn't long for the technology y'all work on was telling me about ADHD, or Adult Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, or colloquially we typically just say ADD. And I go down to Barnes & Noble a couple days later, and I find this book called Driven to Distraction. I'm sitting at Barnes & Noble, I read the whole thing there in a day, and I simultaneously want to start jumping for joy, because it's explaining all these people who have stories that are so similar to mine. I don't feel as alone anymore. But I also want to cry, because it's explaining so much of the desperation that I had felt. And it's telling these stories about people whose lives were ruined by so many of the same behavioral patterns that I was going through. And so it still took me about a year after finding this book, reading a couple other books, and basically self-diagnosing with ADD. It took a year and leaving my parents' house, moving to Chicago, thinking maybe if I could just start over in Chicago, of working different jobs and working a job for a few months and starting off really strong, and then getting to a place where I felt like I was about to get fired and bouncing to a different job before they could fire me. But eventually, I set up an appointment with a therapist. I probably used Google to find her as well, so thank you for that. Her name is Lori. I went to see her and go through the tests, and I come back basically it's you kind of get a Scantron, you fill out kind of a survey, you have some folks you work with or folks who've known you for a long time to do it, you give them to them, they go through the results, you come back a couple weeks later, and they give you the diagnosis. And Lori says, when I come back later, she says, you definitely have ADD. She's like, you are off the charts. And at this point, I'm like, yes. Because you see, this was finally an explanation for me. It was an explanation for my behavior that wasn't just me being a lazy bastard. Right? Like it was a way to explain what had kept happening to me in a way, and not only that, but it was a way to point me towards a group of folks who struggled with similar struggles that I did, and so that I could learn from them and I could learn coping mechanisms from them. But she goes, but I think you might also have type 2 bipolar. And I was like, no, I'll take the ADD. And you can keep the bipolar, because that's what crazy people have. And I didn't know anything about bipolar back then, aside from like what I'd seen in the movies and stuff, which isn't particularly accurate. So bipolar is also called manic depression. You'll cycle between periods of mania, which are like the good parts. It's actually, mania can feel quite euphoric. You get really hyper, you have a lot more confidence. A lot of people actually who have bipolar don't want to go get treatment because they don't want to give up the mania part. And then you'll cycle down through depression. And for me, for type 2 bipolar, basically the cycles are a little bit more elongated. Instead of full-blown mania, I have what's called hypomania. And so it's not quite as severe. And how it would typically play out for me is that I would have weeks when I would be depressed. And when I was depressed, I would sleep a lot. Just going through my day felt like walking through a swimming pool. Everything felt heavy. It felt like I was constantly trying to like climb up a rocky incline, and like the gravel just kept coming out from underneath me, and I could just never make any progress. Like if I could just feed myself and show up to work before noon, like that would be a good day. And then sometimes for some reason, something would happen to trigger it, or sometimes for seemingly no reason at all, I would just get a lot of energy, and I'd get really optimistic, and if you found me on those days, I'd talk really fast, and I'd have all these great ideas for projects, and I have to like start them all tonight, and I have to ship them by tomorrow, in part because like if I don't ship it tomorrow, I don't know if on like Friday I'm gonna have enough emotional energy left over to leave the house, let alone keep working on a thing. And this cycle would just keep going for looking back for years. And I think I was fortunate that I had journals. And so when I went to meet with a therapist, I could look at the pattern over time and say this kept happening. And a lot of people who have bipolar will end up getting diagnosed with just depression because you tend to go see the therapist when you're depressed. And if you don't look at the long time frame, then oftentimes it's easy to have it be misdiagnosed. But I wasn't ready to accept any of this stuff today. I was ready for the ADHD. I'd been living like with that diagnosis in my head for a little bit. I was able to accept that. So I start taking meds for ADD, basically stimulants like Adderall or Ritalin. I take something called dextroamphetamine. And I remember like the first day I took it, 10 minutes later, I was like, holy shit. I was like, is this what everybody else feels like? Like I could make a list and I could like do everything on the list and do it in that order. I spent like an hour cleaning my house. It was amazing. But a big problem about me taking the stimulants and not treating the bipolar is that the stimulants helped me focus. And when I would get depressed, I would focus a lot on how depressed I was. And so it actually exacerbated the depression, and it made things worse. Now, around the same time, I met this guy, Josh Golden. I had started playing a lot of poker after I failed out of school. It turns out people who have bipolar actually have significantly higher risk tolerances than the general population. And I met Josh playing poker. He ran a small web consultancy in Chicago, and I had started working for him. And it was my dream job at the time. You know, I was doing good work, especially when I started. It was a really small team, working with a lot of different clients. And then same pattern started to appear that had been happening everywhere else. I had just started to get depressed. I stopped showing up to work until afternoon. And finally, it came to a head after I'd been there for about a year. And I had this project that I was supposed to be working on, and I hadn't even started. I'd been in the office till like 2 in the morning every night that week, just trying to get started on it, not even trying to finish it. And then Josh was leaving for this trip on like this Friday. Josh and I lived a few blocks from each other. And he was been trying to check in on like the status of this project. hadn't gotten a hold of me. And so he decides to come see, make sure I'm okay. And so for the second time in a few years, I had a coworker walk into my apartment while I was still sleeping and ask if I was okay. And this time I just couldn't hide anymore. You know, I think the deal I had sort of made with myself was, I don't know how to change this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to contain the damage to myself. I'm going to make sure no one else gets hurt. And I think what I finally had to realize was that if I was suffering from a mental illness, everyone close to me was suffering too. Whether it was my friends from unkept commitments, whether it's my parents from their fear and frustration about me turning out okay, whether it was my coworkers from me continually dropping the ball. I was hurting so many people around me by trying to keep things to myself. I also realized that I was very fortunate to be employed and to have health insurance. And that on the trajectory that I was on, those two things weren't likely to continue. And if I didn't see someone right away, then I might lose my chance to do so. And so I set up an appointment with a psychiatrist. It was about 2 years after a therapist, a trained professional told me that I have bipolar. I finally went to see a psychiatrist to talk about it. And I go see the psychiatrist, and I tell him the story. And he comes back, he's like, type 2 bipolar sounds exactly like what you're describing. And he's like, you're actually really fortunate. We have really good meds for type 2 bipolar. We got this stuff called Lamictal. It is really effective at treating people who have type 2 bipolar. There's basically no side effects. Actually, that's not true. There is one side effect. A really small percentage of people who take Lamictal end up getting a life-threatening rash inside their anus. And I was like, wait, hold up. I actually said to him, I'm pretty sure if I get a life-threatening rash inside my anus, I'm still going to be depressed. But didn't happen. It's been about 15 years or thereabouts or so, and so far so good. And life, once I started taking these meds, just slowly over time started to get better. It was very different than taking the stimulants. Stimulants is like right away, it's like I knew they kicked in. This was just like over a few months, things started to get better. And this was, I guess this is about 12 years or so ago. And I am so ridiculously fortunate. The Lamictal worked for me the first time. I didn't have to try med after med after med, trying to find something that worked. The side effects are pretty low. I sometimes think they might affect my memory a little bit, but for the most part, no noticeable side effects. I don't have to do this hard math that a lot of people who are trying different meds for mental health have to do of like what's worse, the condition or the side effects that I take to treat the condition. I also met my wife right around the same time. This is Rachel, and she and I met right around this. Actually, we met the same day I set up the appointment with a psychiatrist, and she came alongside me and just helped me, supported me, helped me out of the hole. My parents were super supportive despite their frustration. Basically, everything after like having bipolar was kind of a best case scenario for me. A lot of people who have what I have aren't nearly as fortunate. These stats are from the National Association of Mental Illness. The estimates are that 1 in 5 adults in America experience a mental illness, and 1 in 25 live with a serious mental illness. And for here, they estimate about 2.5% of the population have bipolar. And about 10 to 20% of people who have bipolar actually die from it. In large part because about 1 in 3 people who have bipolar will attempt suicide at some point in their life. It actually has a higher mortality rate than some forms of cancer do. So all of this kind of begs the question of Why am I here today speaking about this? Just as a show of hands, how many of you know someone, a friend, a family member, a coworker, who has gone through some sort of mental health crisis? And if you're willing, how many of you have been through something yourself? Thanks for raising your hands. I'm going to go through a couple symptoms of bipolar and ADHD. And these are chosen for effect, all right? These are. I'm not a doctor. I'm not trying to prescribe anyone, but these are things that I personally deal with, all right? So hyper-focusing, so that's, it's hard to get started on something, but once you do, you lock in on it. It's really hard to get distracted, pulled away from it. You forget to eat, forget to go to the bathroom. There's racing thoughts, which is basically what it sounds like. There's pressured speech, which is when the racing thoughts try to escape through the small hole of your mouth. There's irregular sleep, especially onset insomnia. It's hard to fall asleep at night. It's impossible to wake up in the morning. Social isolation, thoughts of grandiosity, thinking that you can change the world, thinking that you can solve problems that no one else has ever solved before. If you're a young adult or an adolescent and you're experiencing some of these symptoms, finding the tech industry probably feels a little bit like coming home to you. We will accept the socially isolated. We will accommodate irregular sleep patterns and inconsistent bursts of productivity. And thoughts of grandiosity, it's like, if you want to change the world, there's what company has changed the world more than Google over the last 20 years? What industry has changed the world more than the tech industry over the last 20 years? There's this famous commercial from Apple. They say, "Here's to the crazy ones," because where the rest of the world sees crazy, we see genius. And it's the people who are crazy enough to believe that they can change the world are the ones who do. And I don't know of any study or anything, this is just me guessing, but my guess is that whatever the rate of mental illness is in the general population, that it's higher in our industry. And in fact, the history of computer science is rife with tragedy related to mental illness. Alan Turing, often credited as the grandfather of modern computer science, committed suicide. And then about 7 years ago, there was a New York hacker called Aaron Swartz, who we also lost in the same way. And in 2006, Aaron wrote this. He said, "Surely there are times when you've been sad. Perhaps a loved one has abandoned you, or a plan has gone horribly awry. Your face falls. Perhaps you cry. You feel worthless. You wonder whether it's worth going on. Everything you think about seems bleak. The things you've done, the things you hope to do, the people around you. You want to lie in bed and keep the lights off. Depressed mood is like that, only it doesn't come for any reason and it doesn't go for any either. Go outside and get some fresh air or cuddle with a loved one and you don't feel any better, only more upset at the joy that everyone else seems to feel. Everything gets colored by the sadness. Depression causes nearly half of all disability. It affects 1 in 6 and explains more current unhappiness than poverty. Sadly, depression is not seen as real enough to deserve the investment and awareness of other conditions. And there is, of course, the shame. The shame is what's killing us. It's the shame and the stigma around mental illness is why we don't talk about it. See, we don't have cures for mental illness, but we have pretty good treatments. Therapy has changed the lives of millions of people. Meds have worked wonders in my life and many others, but the reason why our friends and our family members and our coworkers aren't getting to those treatments is because of the stigma. It's because we think differently as a society about the conditions that affect the brain than we do anything that happens below the neck. Like if I stood up here and I told you that I took insulin for diabetes, right? No one would think, well, aren't you afraid you're going to be dependent upon that? Like no one would be like, hey, aren't you afraid maybe you're just like using that insulin as a crutch? But we think about these things differently. We actually use different words, like even that phrase, like using as a crutch. Has anyone here ever used crutches before? Using crutches are really hard. I don't know how using it as a crutch became a euphemism for like taking the easy way out. Like it's way easier just to stay on your couch, right? But some people who have injuries decide to use these medical assistive devices so they can go on and live their life. And for some people, they'll use crutches for a short period of time until their body gets healthy. And some other people will use crutches for the rest of their life. But we never walk up to someone who like busted their ankle and say, hey, aren't you afraid maybe you're using that padded pole as a crutch? Like there's no other industry. We don't go to someone who wears glasses and say, have you like tried seeing harder? We talk about these things differently. That's what we talk about when we talk about the stigma. And so just as we finish up, I wanted to chat a little bit about things that you could do to help here. I wanted to talk from two different perspectives. The first perspective is just are there any managers in the room? Folks, a few? Cool. And just things that you can do if someone you work with or someone on your team might be struggling. And the first is to just cultivate vulnerability here in your workplace and in your team. I want to share another story from my life, and the story I just shared is from, like I said, it's like over a decade ago when I was going through the worst of it. And I've been I have my meds here. So this is my Lamictal. And I remember, it's funny, when I very first started taking actually my Adderall, or for me, my Dextrin, I remember going to work and being really ashamed about it. I'd go to the bathroom. I didn't want anyone to see that I was taking anything, right? So this is my Lamictal that I take. I take it every day. I basically take it every day, more or less, for 15 years. So this is what it looks like when someone takes their crazy pills. Just like everything else. Now, I've taken those meds every day. Side effects aren't great, but like I said, I do wonder if they affect my memory. And so about 2 years ago, it'd been about a decade, I was like, maybe I should just see what life might be like off of them. So I went off them, and after a couple months, they were out of my system, and a few things started to happen. First thing that I noticed that happened is I got really into chess. I started playing so much chess, especially these speed games, 2-3 minute games. And I remember I read 2 biographies of Bobby Fischer. I remember this quote. There's this quote from, I don't remember his name, but it's someone like, chess doesn't make sane people crazy. Chess keeps crazy people sane. And I think the fact that quote resonated with me probably should have been a sign that I needed to go back on my meds. But the second thing that started to happen is I got really depressed again. And when I got really depressed, I started sleeping late again. I got off all my routines, and then my work output just plummeted. And at the time, I was trying to hire someone for my team, and I remember writing up this job description and basically getting a sentence into it, and then just being stuck for a week. I remember showing up to work. I was like, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to get this done today. I'm going to ship it. And I told people, hey, I'm going to ship this. And I just couldn't do it. I just could not make my brain type the words. So I'll play a game of chess. I'll just play one more. I'll play one more. As long as I start on this by noon, I'll be okay. And then noon would come, and then okay, well, 12:30, maybe just one more, and then I'll just go do a thing. Okay, it's not going to happen today. I'll try again tomorrow. And it just went on for days. And then I was like, man, I'm not getting any work done here. At some point, someone's going to realize that I don't actually do any work here, and I'm going to get fired. and it would be really embarrassing to get fired. So maybe I should just quit. At this point, I had been with Twilio for about 4 years. I've been there about 5.5 now. I was like, maybe I should just quit before anyone finds out, And I am so fortunate to have a manager. This is Ricky, my manager, who I've talked to about this stuff. And one day on our one-on-one, he's like, how are you doing? And I knew that it was safe for me just to say, not good. I said, I'm really depressed right now. And he just said, all right, what do you need? And took some stuff off my plate. I said, again, I'm fortunate, I know what meds work. I just need to go see my psychiatrist, get back on them. It's gonna take me a few weeks. And he worked with me and I got healthy again. It took a few weeks and I had work I had to do. But I can tell you that I had started this spiral that started with not being able to get my work done and then just spiraled to very quickly to maybe I should leave. And as soon as I was able to say to someone I worked with, especially my manager, I'm depressed right now, that spiral stopped. And then I was able to start making progress again. And I feel so fortunate that we have a place where I work at Twilio where we can, at least on my team, if nothing else, but more broadly at Twilio too, have seen it, where we could chat about this. And it's not just, it seems like it's not just our company, it seems like the tech industry as a whole, as evidenced by the fact that I'm standing here speaking to you all today at a work event. And we're seeing this more, the tech industry is a lot more progressive. There was this tweet a couple years ago where this woman, Madeline, tweeted the email that her CEO sent her after she had told the whole company that she needed to take a mental health day. And this tweet got 16,000 retweets. There is a hunger in our country to work at a place where people can bring their whole selves to work, where they don't have to hide the illnesses that keep them from doing their jobs. So if you as a manager are able to cultivate vulnerability in your team, to create a place where people on your team can talk about this stuff, it's just gonna pay dividends. You're gonna retain folks. People are gonna be more productive. We have this myth of the 10X developer, right? But if you take a developer who's depressed and you help them get the right treatment, their productivity will 10X. Mine did. The second thing, if you are going through this yourself, the best thing you can do is to talk to someone about it. This is my guy. This is Dr. Mark Dollar. He's a psychiatrist who I see not too far from here. And over the last 12 whatever years, I've had a number of psychiatrists and therapists, and I know there's a huge stigma. I know I was reluctant to go see someone. And it's weird that there's that stigma to see someone to talk about this stuff. I know that when I go see my therapist, sometimes it's really tempting at work just to tell folks, oh, I have a doctor's appointment, not I'm going to go see my therapist. But I had the opportunity to go to the U.S. Open last week. Has anyone been to the U.S. Open before? A couple of you? Yeah, so I'm not into tennis at all. My dad is. My dad's a lifelong tennis player and tennis fan, and it was a bucket list thing for him. And the cool thing about tennis is it's actually a really spectator-friendly sport. It's as one of the women I work with explained to me today, last week she's a tennis fan. She's like, here's the rules of tennis. There's a yellow ball, hit it between the white lines. Done. And then she's like, and then let me explain the scoring to you. And then there's 15 minutes of that. But it's actually a lot of fun to watch. And so it was amazing privilege. I flew my parents to New York, bought the tickets, and we got to go see it. And one of the really cool things is how close you can get to the players. And so here's Serena Williams. Serena Williams wins her first round match, 20-some thousand people in Arthur Ashe Stadium. She wins in under an hour. She just crushes her opponent. This is 10 a.m. the next day. 10 a.m. the next day, she's back out on the practice courts. And the guy standing next to her is her coach. Serena Williams, greatest of all time. She's got a coach. Unless you are better at managing your emotions than Serena Williams is at playing tennis, chances are you could probably use a coach. You could probably use an objective third party who has studied how to help people get better at this thing and to help you live your life a little bit better. And you should feel just as ashamed about admitting that you need that help as Serena is ashamed as admitting that she has a coach. But again, we have this stigma because it has to do with our brain. And I think sometimes for the folks like us in this room, that stigma and that reluctance can be even stronger because all of us make our livelihood and to some extent our identity is based on how well our brain works, right? Like especially at a place like Google where there's this mythology about how smart you have to be here. And it can be really terrifying to admit that something in your brain's not working the same way that you would like it to, and to admit that you need help there. But working with a therapist or a psychiatrist is a way that you can get better, the way that you can improve the quality of your life. Finding a therapist, finding a psychiatrist can be a huge pain in the ass. It is by far like the worst part of this process. If you don't have, if you don't work for a company that makes this easier for you, ZocDoc makes it relatively easy. There's also Psychology Today. Folks who work at Google, you probably have an employee assistance program. I've actually heard that the benefits here are pretty generous in that regard. And so you can, I think Google's done a good job, and a lot of companies these days have done a good job in reducing the friction to getting you your first appointment, because that can be really difficult. But there are very few moments in my life where I can look back and I can say, that's the day when the trajectory of my life changed for the better. And the first day that I set up an appointment with a therapist is one of them, and the day that I set up an appointment with a psychiatrist is another. And finally, just to wrap up a little bit, for those of you, anyone here who's like in the midst of it right now, again, like I just want to acknowledge, like it's 1 o'clock on a Tuesday after a long holiday. There's other things you could have been doing today. I'm sure you have email. And for some reason, you showed up to this room, right? And I just want to acknowledge, like, there's probably something going on in your life, right? Like, whether it's a friend or whether it's something you personally are going through, there's some reason why you chose to come here today. And if things seem really dark right now, like if it feels like there's no hope, I just want to like encourage you that when I was living in that shitty apartment in college, I had many, many nights when I went to bed praying that God wouldn't wake me up. I didn't think things could ever get better. And one thing that is important to recognize with mental illness is that almost by definition, your brain is lying to you. That your brain is taking in the data, it's running it through a faulty analysis process, and it's spitting back what is often an incorrect conclusion. And I see that now when I look back on the life where I was then, and I thought the life could never get better. I thought I would never get a job. I thought my parents would always be disappointed in me. I thought people would never be able to depend on me. And like I said, last week, I had the opportunity to take my dad to the US Open, whereas I thought that he would forever be disappointed in the way that I performed in college. I thought I'd never get out of that rut. I thought I'd never be able to make him proud. I thought that I would never get a job, that I'd never have professional opportunities, and today I've had the incredible privilege of standing on stage at Google to speak to you all. And I thought that no one would ever be able to depend on me. And on Thursday, my daughter is going to start kindergarten. And I never could have imagined the absolute joy that would have come from having her, or how great it'd be to be married to my wife. So for those of you who are in the midst of things right now and things just seem dark and it seems like things can never get better, just know that things can get better. And the first step on the path towards improving your life is to talk to someone about it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing with us today.
Thanks.
That was great.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. How are you feeling?
I feel good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So I wanted to sort of start by saying this isn't the first time I've seen this talk or spoken to Greg. And I want to tell a little bit of a story of my own, if that's okay.
That'd be great.
So about a year ago in April, we got coffee at the Washington Square Park fountain. I was like, Greg, I'm burned out, can't do this. This is when I started looking for the job that eventually led me to Google. And I was like, what should I do? And you were like, go see a therapist. And like a year later, in April of this year, that's actually when I started doing therapy as well. So like you directly inspired me to do that. So yeah, thank you. It's been life-changing.
Well, I mean, first off, like, it's amazing to hear, and thanks for saying that. Thanks for sharing that here, because sometimes I think my fear in like doing talks like this is that it's like, oh, that one person did the thing, but I think that it's so much more powerful when peers see a peer go through this, and also to hear that it's not me, right? Like it's lots of people are seeing therapists, and I think just you sharing the story is like the more folks who share the story, the more common it becomes.
Yeah.
As much as you talked about a lifelong process, pretty much, to get to a point where you accept, where you deal with what's going on, if you had to look back and give advice to folks around you that might recognize some signs, what advice would you give to help through the process and not giving, hey, take these pills, you're going to feel
Yeah, right. I really try to be careful when I give this talk. Like the only thing that I personally can speak authoritatively on is my story, right? So anyone, and folks will come up and say, hey, I wonder if I might have a thing, what do you think? Or the answer is see a professional. Like these folks go to school for like a decade so that they can be professionally qualified to diagnose, and these are very nuanced conditions and to point you in the right direction. And so the cost of doing, like it's, insurance is hard, and a lot of folks, especially in New York, San Francisco, like you have to pay them, and finding someone's hard. So I don't want to pretend like it's inexpensive your effort or financially to do so, but the opportunity is so great. And really, like in the same way that if someone came to me and said, hey, I have this lump here, like on my arm, like what do you think it is? I'd be like, you should probably go see a doctor and find out. Like, don't ask me, but I can tell you what happened when I had a lump, And so that's generally, I think, just seeing a professional is the best possible first step.
Yeah. Neither of us are mental health professionals.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. And yeah, I guess for the Googlers in the room, so we have EAP. And through Lyra Health, you can get 25 therapy sessions covered for therapists here in the US for all US employees, which is pretty great. And we have a program called Blue Dot, which is basically like, I'm okay to just talk to you about mental health in general. Not necessarily what's going on with me, but like this idea of being open about having conversations with mental health is something actually encouraged in the workplace. And you can go to go/Blue Dot if you want to find out more about that.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So I think, like a lot of people, you often end up in the situation of knowing a friend or family member who's been diagnosed with a condition, and you don't necessarily want to ask them to explain to you in detail what does this condition mean, but looking up information about mental health conditions on the internet is rather hazardous approach. Do you have any recommendations on just when you want to find out about a particular condition that someone might have and want to get some useful general information without falling down rabbit holes of made-up nonsense?
Oh, that's a good question. And do you find that you don't necessarily want to ask that person directly about it?
Yeah, there's sort of, you don't want to make someone explain everything.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily feel comfortable explaining.
Yeah. Oh, wow, that's a good question. I'll answer it. This is not going to directly answer your question, but I think maybe to kind of on that bit about like they don't necessarily feel comfortable explaining. I think like maybe one tactic might be to like how could you make them feel more comfortable explaining, right? And I think that's one. The way that I experience type 2 bipolar is probably different than the person next to me, and there's probably this generalized bucket, but our experience would be different. What I have generally found, and truthfully, the reason why I gave this talk the first time I ever gave it, is that we had a coworker who he was struggling with similar symptoms that I had been struggling with in the past, and one day kind of was chatting with him and just shared my story, and when I got done sharing my story, he said, yeah, I've kind of wonder if maybe I have something similar too. And unfortunately, he ended up passing away before he was able to get help. But that kind of is what like spurred me to like, start just sharing my story more broadly. And that seems to be like when I meet people who I think are struggling with something, I found it's not effective to go up to them and be like, hey, I think you might have bipolar. Have you considered that? But what it seems like works is to be vulnerable first. And it might not be mental illness, right? Like everybody has something that they are ashamed of, and everybody has something that society's told them they shouldn't talk about. And sharing that often cultivates that vulnerability that creates a space where the person might feel comfortable sharing their experience with you. But ultimately, it's going to be their journey to go through, and it'll take time to open up. But that's what I found is just to be vulnerable first and to create space for them to be vulnerable, and then hope that they take the invitation.
Oh, I was just going to follow on that. One of the things I've heard from folks is that they can find it just exhausting to have to explain like the basics of what's going on with them over and over again to everyone that they meet as well. And so like letting them sort of tell you what they want, but not necessarily pushing beyond that can also be really good.
That's great.
Hi, thanks. I know you said that when you shared with your manager what you were going through, he was able to kind of take some stuff off your plate.
Yeah.
And I was wondering outside of that, if there was anything in like your work environment that you felt like was really helpful for you to handle the symptoms that you were having, or any kind of other accommodations.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel really fortunate in the role that I have, and that there's so much that I can do, and I've been given permission, and then also like given myself permission over the years to gravitate towards the stuff that I'm good at and to do less of the things that I'm not good at. And so, I'm not very good at admin type work, and so I try to do more public speaking. I enjoy this, and so I think that that's like kind of broadly speaking, but I feel like at companies that are growing rapidly, there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of like different types of roles, and whether explicitly or implicitly, just having the ability to not feel shame about the stuff that I'm not good at, because I don't know, like expense reports still just crush me, and I have to get them done, but like I'm trying to get to a place where I don't feel guilty about that anymore. It's like I have to get it done, but I'm not going to beat myself up over it because I can provide other value to the company, and then just to kind of more proactively go out and try to seek out those opportunities that play to my strengths instead of beating myself up over my weaknesses.
Great. Anything else you'd like to add?
I mean, just for the folks in this room, from what I hear, Google makes it really easy for you to, easier than you're going to find anywhere else in the world, probably to, outside of a company like this, to see a professional. I've heard from some folks who had good experience with that. It's not perfect, but if some of this stuff here just rang true for you, it's really like can be a life-changing experience for you, and we just really encourage y'all to take Google up on the offer there to help you get some help, some professional help there if you're leaning that direction. Other than that, thank you all very much. Seriously, it's when I told my mom I was going to come speak at Google, she was like pretty stoked about that, and I actually told my 5-year-old this morning. I was like, my wife's like tells Emma like, hey, Daddy's got to talk today, and Emma's like, oh, okay. I'm like, I'm going to go speak at Google, and Emma's like, Google? Yeah. So, and thank you, Sam, for setting this up. I know it took a lot of work. It's truly an honor to be here and to be able to speak here on the stage. And so, thank you all for coming and showing up. And it was really quite an honor to be here. So, thank you.
Great. All right. Thank you.